today. This is a report about 2 workshops I've done together with Doris Allhutter, who is here today. So that's absolutely great because this will be my rendering of how I was kind of a participant and co-organizer of the workshops, but I'm sure Doris can add some very relevant things from her perspective, because she really is the originator of this method that we were using in the Deconstructing FAT workshops. Okay, I will start into this as a computer scientist and say what has been, in a sense, my motivation or my types of motivations for doing that kind of seminar, in which we use deconstructive methods to unearth what we are actually making in terms of assumptions. And this is one of my pet peeves. One of the classic articles in the area where Tanya Sweeney looked at Google search results and found that when she Googled her own name, the system offered her to check arrests. And then ads by Google were all kinds of things where where the user could be looking for her criminal record. And now many of you will know who LaTanya Sweeney is, but I'll show you a photo just in case. So what's wrong here? What's the fairness issue, probably? And people who've read the article can speak up, or people who haven't can speak up as well. Do we see people who raise their hands here? We don't. So if you feel you want to add, you want to say something, just speak. When she looked for a Dorothy something, Dorothy Smith name, she didn't get those ads. Does that help?
Yeah. Yeah,
Go ahead.
You see the Google ads, and it immediately asks if she's been arrested, and there is a link to her public records, which I guess from a European context we don't quite know what it is, but it's her. Is it her criminal records?
That I would think so. Yes.
Yeah.
So do you see bias at work?
I would say it's about her name.
Okay, can you expand on that?
Well, she has a typical Black people's name, and I guess that wouldn't happen if she was called, yeah, as you said, Dorothy Smith or something like that, like a typical white people name.
Which is very much what they did in the article in a more systematic way, generating Black-sounding names and generating white-sounding names and seeing what comes out in terms of recommendations. Okay, so we have, I'm preaching to the choir here, Black people, white people, big issue of bias, obviously, but then Doris mentioned one thing that I would like to take up, that there's something that seems strange by European standards. So anybody has a comment on that? Okay, I'll expand on what Doris is probably thinking as well. I see this and I see, oh, there is a difference in how a US-American search engine deals with US-American names. There seems to be an obvious case of bias and unfairness that disadvantages a group that's already disadvantaged, namely people with Black-sounding names who usually are Black people. But is that, I mean, what does that mean? Do we want to make the search engine show arrest records for everybody? Because then it wouldn't be biased anymore? I guess depending on where you start from, that could be your goal, or that could just not be your goal, because you'd say the problem here is that a search engine shows people's arrest records at all. And so maybe there's a totally different unfairness going on. Maybe there's a discrimination against people who've ever had some criminal conviction, and it shouldn't be the case. But if we're only looking from this bias and unfairness angle that we typically look at, where we have these two set groups and they get some unequal treatment, then we wouldn't even ask about that. We would be targeting an equalizing of an unjust, from let's say European standpoint, treatment across different groups. And it's been experiences like that that have really made me long for methods to become more attuned and more aware of such hidden assumptions, like that it's totally okay to have that kind of search engine result. And so the question for me when I engage in that work is, how can I encourage such questioning in myself, and of course having a mission here as a teacher also in others. And so the idea was a little bit to take this idea of fat and throw it around and unbalance it and deconstruct it. And the basic focus we had in this work, Doris and I, was to trace algorithmic bias. The method itself has been used for very different things outside this work as well and prior to this work. So let me just give you a brief introduction. I mean, we know the research field. That's why we're here. The fairness in machine learning, or study of bias, study of debiasing, study of discrimination aware, data mining, and so on and so forth. Very much embodied in the FAT-ML, FAT-STAR, and now FACT community. So the idea is we want to remove bias from data classifications, models, and ontologies, where debiasing, but we need to say here that, of course, this is a value judgment, and this debiasing also enacts implicit and normative decisions. So in order to understand better what we're doing there, the general stance is one of deconstruction, where we say, what are these implicit assumptions, values, and norms that we, as the FAT researchers, or FACT or FAT-ML, mobilize as part of our practices. And these practices are the ones to do with ontological as well as epistemic, meaning what we assume exists and how we go about it. Okay, and the question is, why am I presenting that here? Is that relevant for CyCAT? And I guess yes, that's why they invited me. And I've just taken some snippets from the webpage that says we inform and educate people about algorithmic bias and collaborate with researchers around the world. And we want to understand the nature and impact of human biases in information systems and develop tools, techniques, trainings to promote algorithmic transparency and media-related algorithmic literacy. So the topic is definitely very much on target. And then as soon as I dive down into a CyCAT paper, I find so many hooks. So for example, this is really, the sampling method was take the topmost paper on their publications page. It talks about image classification and how they analyzed automatic tagging of faces in the Chicago face database. And in terms of method, the three researchers independently inspected the tags, blah, 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 grouped them by concept, so did kind of onto-epistemic work here. And the researchers met regularly to discuss until a consensus was reached. So all the elements are in place. You have different, several researchers working in the field, doing individual work, doing collective work, trying to understand what's going on in the space. And so I'm sure you have a lot more settings of this type, and it would be absolutely great if you could profit from the method of deconstructing FAT that that I'll be presenting in the coming slides. So as I already said, this method of so-called mind scripting is a development by Doris Allhutter and colleagues, and it's already been tried and tested in a number of application areas. So what is it? It's a collective method of deconstruction that aims at making visible the implicit assumptions, norms, and values in social practices, in our case, in these meaning-making practices. It's based on theories of discourse, ideology, memory, and effect, and it works with written memories of a participating group. So why memories? Memories are really interesting. As scientists, we are so often told to take ourselves as people out of the picture. And of course, you know, as soon as you take a somewhat more social or sciencey angle or a humanistic angle, you know that you shouldn't do that and that you can't do it. But still, memories and personal memories are something, is a sort of text genre we really do not engage in very much in my field, my surroundings. And why are memories interesting? Because they are not a direct representation of the past. Memories are always re-memorized and remade. They are dynamic and they emerge with our perceptions. They are selective and constantly being reworked. And they show how we attribute meanings to people, things, events, concepts, and practices. And of course, they reflect our individuality, but also how we collectively construct things. And so memories tell us a hell of a lot in a very interesting way about the social or societal relations that we're in while we're doing the research, teaching, or other work we're doing. And so because we want to unearth all these socially founded things, they are a really good method or a kind of vehicle for finding out. Okay, and so as you may have seen already in the announcement of this talk, we ran 2 workshops with this goal where we used mind scripting for unearthing these implicit assumptions in FAT. The first one was at KU Leuven in October 2018, and the second in Barcelona at the FAT Star Conference this January, just before COVID. And you will see names that you may recognize. It's very nice to see that we have people here today who have taken part, and maybe they could speak up as well and when we go into discussion. And it's been very interesting because that was really people with a lot of background and a lot of reflectivity about doing fairness in machine learning work. Okay, so how does it work? So Doris conducted individual interviews with all the participants in the first step. And then based on that, we discussed what could be a good question or title that everybody might be able to relate to. And then everybody got the homework with that title. and they did that individually, and the homework was very simple. Write a text entitled, in the first round we had when she, he, or they operationalized discrimination. In the second, we called it when they, he, she negotiated, operationalized a fairness goal, or when they discussed a fairness goal. And that gave us lots of texts from each individual, from each participant, one text. And you see kind of the length here. We encourage people to write about half a page, which most people did. Then this fourth step is a bit of a pragmatic choice when you know you don't have that much time for discussion, which happened to us in the second iteration. We ranked the texts by how we thought they would be useful for stimulating discussion. And then the important part here is this collective deconstruction, when as a group we discuss individual texts in turn. And we did that using a question list. This question list is here, and I'll give you important questions on the next slide. And then the interesting part of writing up results of 2 days of discussion, which Doris has spent a lot of time on, and which I would say is still an ongoing project. And then the 7 is, in a sense, the hope. And I think I would definitely say for myself, the fulfilled hope to apply lessons learned from this in our own work. Okay, so key questions, and they're not all, but I really think they also for me embody the most important aspects here. The idea is you title this text by saying when he, she, they, pick your favorite pronoun, discuss a fairness goal. So we, in principle, as a group, do not know who the author is. The author talks about themselves in the third person, which is also a very helpful technique. And so we really talk about the author as if we don't know who it is, which, in many cases didn't really work because we knew each other so well, but it doesn't matter. You try to take this step to distance yourself from the actual person. And so then we can, without having this ballast of a famous researcher's name, see how does this person present her or himself, and then which actions and interests and emotions are mentioned in the text. Then we look at what other people exist in the text and how are they presented, again with these same attributes. Then do we find specific linguistic features that strike us? Which causalities are assumed in the texts? Which assumptions are they based on? How are these made to seem self-evident, even if they maybe aren't? Are there cliches? Are there figures that are being used? What do they express? And then, of course, every deconstructionist's favorite thing to say also, what is missing? Are there any omissions, blind spots, interruptions in the text? And are there any breaks in logic or in writing style? Are there any contradictions? And so everybody takes that list, goes through the text that's being discussed at the moment, and takes notes. And then we really go through these questions one by one and discuss them in the group, which, if you've never done that kind of method, I can tell you is amazing, because you see so much that others perceive in the same way, and you see so many other things that you never would have realized, and it gets so deep so fast. Okay, so now the computer scientist in me, of course, wants to say these were the results, And that's also where it gets very interesting for me, because it's different from what I'm used to, because that can be very hard to distill. I think we hit upon a very frequently reoccurring theme in the first workshop, and this lends itself very easily to being discussed here. So I'm going to take the so-called accuracy-fairness trade-off, and this picture wasn't so clear to me in the second workshop, but I hope Doris will say a few words about that later from her perception. And so results feels important to talk about, but it's not the central thing. And I really have to emphasize that. Or the result, the tangible results, in the sense of we learned about X, Y, Z. So with all this preamble, I'm going to go into the accuracy-fairness trade-off results that we have. So many people described how they had talked to, for example, social scientists, and said, well, the problem if we're debiasing algorithms is that we lose accuracy. And the aha moment for many of these computer scientists was that an audience of social scientists or of lawyers did not understand this statement. So here is one snippet from one of the texts. She further explained that controlling for discrimination in predictive models comes at a price of accuracy. That is, accuracy goes down if we want to remove biases. They, this is the audience, could not understand this. They said, if we think that biases are unjustified, that they are resulting from artifacts in data, shouldn't removing discrimination improve accuracy? So there is a notion of accuracy that we tend to use, coming from machine learning. This is what accuracy is, the percentage of correctly predicted exemplars from the training or test data. And then the audience takes this notion of accuracy and says, accuracy should be how things relate to the real world. And then if you take away something bad and biased, it would automatically improve accuracy. Okay, so that was a very interesting thing, that many people shared this experience of something we take for granted, a certain so-called trade-off that is absolutely not explainable to outsiders. And then what is linked to that is the question of what's the ground truth, because of course when we talk about accuracy, we talk about accuracy with relation to what we think is ground truth. And then again, one of the participants wrote, there's biases relative to the real world ground truth, and then there's a difference to the ideal world ground truth. So discrimination has real world effects on people's ability to perform in jobs, for instance. It might be true that if you hire a black person to serve racist customers, they will sell less stuff. So it's true that if your model is predicting sales volume, it might be accurate in that sense. But it's not accurate to an ideal world in which the customers are not racist. So the reference frame changes once you start echoing and mirroring this exchange with outsiders, or even the thoughts that you had yourself when you started to formalize that. In some sense, what can we take away from that is that there is a construction, an implicit construction of a causal relationship between predictive accuracy and non-discrimination. And very much, and we saw that when we analyzed also the linguistic choices around these notions, there is this assumption that predictive accuracy is a general and objective concept, while fairness is normative, ethical, something that comes from the outside, and is a different kind of animal. So there is this opposition between epistemic and societal values, or the seeming opposition, which gets reproduced by this construction of a causal relationship. And when we go further and ask who has these epistemic notions, you know, we define what predictive accuracy is, and we are scientists, and then the others who represent the societal values, there is a perspective of privilege that gets reenacted, and it's privilege who gets to define, and it's privilege and who gets to say what matters. And I think it's very interesting that so many of these slides I took directly from Doris, that this is the summary from a social science perspective of these results, and I'll go in the following slides into something how that changes and transforms in my mind when I still come from that predictive accuracy point of view. So at this point, are there any questions, or Doris, would you like to add something? Because I now go into another part.
I have nothing to add.
Okay.
Unless there is a question that is more about the method or something, I can contribute to that. But I think that was a very good representation of what happened there.
Thank you. And thank you for the slides. And anyway, I mean, 1,000 thanks again for doing that work with me, which is absolutely fantastic. But okay, I said that.
I'm very curious to hear now what changed for you.
Okay, and so, you know, at this point, it's like I come back from the workshop and I think I've learned so much, and my thinking about all these issues is so much deeper now. But what do I do? You know, this inbuilt bias. I want to save the world. I want to build something that's good and unbiased, and you know, all the rest of it. So yes, I know this is solutionism, but on the other hand, I do believe we have that mandate, and so just some very unfinished ideas forward, and some issues that I think matter. So what we saw in this example is we, and now when I say we, I mean we fat people, are constrained by familiar concepts and familiar methods, and accuracy is so familiar, and then trade-offs are so familiar, and fairness becomes a familiar thing. I mean, you know, you put it into a metric, and then you have it defined, and then that's familiar as well. And I think what also happens at this point is, this is just, of course, a super simplified rendering of this trade-off. You have a decision space where you have no clear solution for an optimization problem. If the trade-off looks like that, you have no clearly, in the decision theoretic sense, dominant point or the dominant decision for doing the right thing. You have to have this decision: how much do I value fairness? Of course, after you've selected your favorite fairness measure, and your favorite accuracy measure, then in another step. But in principle, all of these points are good, and which one you pick is a political choice, and that is where many computer scientists throw up their hands in horror because they say this is what we can't do, you know. Which is fine in a sense. As a scientist, you have to show what's possible and what causes what, but it's somewhat unsatisfying as well. And so I think what we saw in the discussion so far is that this is a familiar model with familiar concepts, but it's incomplete. And so it recalls another trade-off or assumed trade-off that has been around for longer, the so-called privacy utility trade-off or risk utility trade-off. And as it happens, this has annoyed me for a long time, and so I wrote a paper about this in 2017, in which I tried to deconstruct this in a forward-looking, solutionist way. But my aim really was to say, let us use this framework, the way we can measure utility in some cardinal way, and where we can measure privacy, which is here the social value, in some cardinal way, and then look at this unsolvable problem or a problem that has no unique optimal solution, and see how we can change that. So the trade-off exists in a data science sense, let's say, because that is really where we start from. In fairness, it was how well can we predict something given related to a certain training or test set. The utility here, you could think of it in the same way that you want to predict something based on data that are somehow full data, no data, or somehow reduced or transformed data. And the more data you take away, the less good your results get in general. And of course, you know, everybody in the room knows that it's not that easy and the curve isn't straight, but the trade-off is still observed or posited very often. So I said, well, and I came from a case study in that paper saying that's not actually true. You know, we may be able to reach the full utility even with less data. And that's, of course, the whole idea of data minimization, that you look at how much data do you really need. So the curve changes already. If I leave that perspective of the data scientist and I go to a perspective of the application builder or the legal person who tries to enforce data minimization, and other stakeholders, for example, the data subjects, might have a very different utility curve. And here I'm not saying they have more utility when they have more privacy, because that is already built in. But what I saw in that case study is that actually a lot of other things suffered when privacy was endangered. So it was all about social relations with colleagues. So there is a clear notion of disutility when you go to more data, and utility if you go to less data. And if you then say we're looking at this problem still as an optimization problem with multiple criteria or multiple stakeholders, and you aggregate over these curves, you say, for example, you know, just a very simple idea, I'm taking the maximum of the application-centric curve and the data science curve, and I'm taking the average or sum, which comes to the same thing, of the application and the other stakeholder curve, then you would get a new optimization problem with a new objective function, and all of a sudden the solution looks completely different. And you may have a unique solution just by redefining the space, but still using the same methods, utility functions, some kind of agreed upon measurement of the social value, privacy or fairness. I think where I ended with that paper was to say, we could do this. We should do this. And I can show you all kinds of useful things that happen along the way. But then, in a sense, I think the next step would be to really try that in some meaningful setting. And that's future work. What I think is very interesting is that this was a prescriptive idea of using optimization problems redefined in order to open up the discussion. There's also a more descriptive angle to that. Some of you may have seen the protective optimization technologies of Seda Gößes and colleagues. That was also presented in FAT Star this year, where they look at certain adversarial techniques and formulate that in a very interesting way as a new optimization problem, where you take multiple stakeholders and external effects into account. Again, it's a first step, because we have instruments for describing things in a richer way, but then what do we do with them? Then another approach that I think is relevant is just exemplified by this table that is contained in the book Data Feminism by Ignacio and Klein. And this created a lot of laughter at not this year's but last year's FAT Star, because someone in the general discussion session stepped up and said, well, you know, this is what authors proposed. These are concepts on the left-hand side that we never want to talk about again, because we never want to hear again, because they uphold some imagined objectivity, and they locate the source of the problem in individuals or technical systems. And we would like to talk about these other words instead, because that acknowledge structural power differentials and work towards dismantling them. So fairness and accountability and transparency, the very words in the title of FAT Star, are all on the left-hand side. And I don't want to go into any of the details here, because we can have a year-long discussion about each and every one of the words on the left-hand side and on the right-hand side. But I think that exercise in itself, and of course targeted actions that follow from that, are extremely relevant. So we go one step further when we do that, because we say we take the concepts that we know, and maybe we need to modify them, but along with these modified concepts or new words also come new methods. So, you know, when I study oppression, I use different methods than when I study bias. All of that still takes place in the in the same groups that we've had before. And so I want to open another really important question here that I'm not the first to open, but it makes me laugh again every time. So representation, another huge word that we can discuss about for a year. So do you notice anything in the picture? Okay, some people will see their own faces, or no? Ah, no, you're just not there. You're not, okay, you're in the angle. But do you notice anything? This is a typical workshop of people talking about bias. Okay, I'll give you one moment.
Somebody said in the chat it's only white people.
Yes. So, you know, I'm about to badmouth this because I'm in the picture, and this is the No Bias project that also is represented in the audience today here.
It's mainly white European people, maybe.
Yes, it's only white European people. It's an EU project. Okay, so we have very interesting things there about the people that are the ESRs, but in principle the PhD students. In principle, that enlarges the group a little bit. And what I think is super interesting, we have this long discussion at the moment about what consent forms we're going to have to submit and sign, each of us, such that the project coordinator is allowed to use our pictures on the website. So it's all about how we are represented and whether we give consent to that. But what we're not asking is who is missing. And of course, you said it already, well, maybe the non-white people. And of course, let's not forget the table affects that as well. And I'm just saying Corona, because at the moment, there's so many more people that we are not seeing. And it really doesn't make this issue of representation a lot better, I think. Do I have a solution for that? I think of course I don't, but I would like to really point out two very good examples that try to make this up. In our workshops with Doris, we had, I would say, we had some little islands of diversity. But I think these two other examples did a kind of stronger job at that. So in one of the translation tutorials at FedStar 2018, which was about criminal justice and bias in criminal justice, they not only had a computer science researcher and a lawyer leading that, but actually a person, a black person, and his black wife, who were directly affected by these pre-trial and bail things that we had been talking about, and that was an incredibly moving experience and very, very, very thought-provoking. So they did put that tutorial on YouTube, so I invite you to watch it. A second thing that I had the privilege of being part of was the intersectionality and algorithmic discrimination workshop that at Lawrence Center, also a couple of years ago, organized by Seda Göses, Francine Deschênes, and Janneke Evers. And it was, in a sense, that same mission. We need to get people, in this case, there was a big, let's say, focus on LGBTQ and ethnic diversity. We need to get these people into the room, and we need to get them better represented as one of the first steps towards towards breaking that mold. And again, a very, very thought-provoking experience. And I heard a little bit, from Seda's stories, how incredibly difficult it had been to master that diverse sample of researchers, and how much more time that cost than what we normally have the time for. Okay, so personal summary, what have I taken from this? This first bullet point is just another summary of the method that I won't repeat. As I said, I don't think I've learned this particular implicit assumption is what we're all having, and it's wrong. But I think it's really changed my way of thinking and my ways of acting. Well, not changed, but definitely modified. So I'm using collective methods of critique in teaching a lot more. I still have stopped short of mind scripting because so far I never seem to have found the right the right point in the course where I could ask people to talk about their own personal memories. Don't know what that tells about me. And I think in research, it does really let me read things differently and focus much more than I did anyway on always trying to see what's missing. And so just to come back to that slide of the relevance for CyCAT, I think, you know, take any random thing like this Chicago face database that I already showed. And then the paper just says, the data set is balanced for gender and race as detailed in table 2. So then these are the example tags that the researchers, the grouping researchers put into these categories. And, you know, I think it would be so interesting to ask here, who are the authors? What are actions, interests, and emotions, maybe even in these meetings that the group had? Who are other people? What is maybe taken for granted as in sense of a cliche, and what's missing? And if I look at this, of course, I chose this for a reason, because it's some of my pet peeves in terms of categories. But you may discover others. I see so many things here. Okay, so is that where we stand? Have we turned FAT on its head? I have to go back in my memories to my former employer and still employer KU Leuven, that shows this beetle on a stick upside down in front of the library. One of these open pieces of art that lets us discuss what science does and what science should do, and maybe how to turn it on its head.